and welcome to Take Two, the show that looks at the issues behind the news. I'm Henshall. First today we have some news reports, and then I'll be talking to Roy Hunter on the ongoing economic meltdown, and we continue with the second part of our interview with Dan Nesbitt of Big Brother Watch. But first, here are the news shorts. Unemployment in Spain soars. We'll be getting a report from Roy Hunter, as I said, a bit later on the ongoing economic crisis in the US and here. But here are some more devastating statistics on the economic crisis that is pushing wide sections of the West towards third world poverty levels. Russia Today has highlighted research from Spain. We reported on how more than 50% of young people there are unemployed, but now official statistics are showing an astonishing 500% increase in the long-term unemployment since 2008, from 250,000 to well over 1 million. While the IMF says Spain has turned the corner, a leading bank admitted that it would take 10 years to return to the pre-2008 levels of unemployment, and that's assuming things don't get bad again. Journalist freedom in the US. It's widely recognised that the massive consolidation of the US media has led to a less diverse news offering, and the media failed to reform itself or even sack one news editor after it was caught peddling brazen lies that led to the illegal attack on Iraq. This has led many to conclude that lying on behalf of Washington is regarded as part of the job in the US mainstream media. Now that conclusion has received support from a poll of journalists conducted by Indiana University. It's based on a large sample and conducted every 10 years. An astonishing 60% thought journalism was headed the wrong way, against under a quarter who disagreed. Over 20 years, those who felt they had almost complete freedom to select their stories fell spectacularly from 60 to just over 30%. That might still sound quite a lot, but remember that most journalists operate in non-controversial areas with run-of-the-mill stories that the owners have little interest in. This inevitably accounts for a large part of the 30% who are still happy. It seems likely that on the big issues of war and peace and the economy, the number of journalists who feel they have freedom to report truthfully and freely is minimal. Libyan resistance continues. At one point during the NATO attack on Libya, there were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Tripoli supporting President Gaddafi. Where are they now? If the Western media are correct in the picture they drew of Libya under Gaddafi, many of those demonstrators were forced to attend. Many more were killed by NATO's airstrikes during the Battle of Tripoli. But where have the rest gone? It seems that they went underground. The Greens, as they call themselves, are even claiming some military successes in the south, as NATO's various factions fight it out in the north. According to their website, the Greens are making alliances with other victims of the new regime, including black Libyans who are treated as second-class citizens and worse by the new rulers. Blair in trouble again. Tony Blair's aide at the time, Sir Jeremy Haywood, now Cabinet Secretary, has effectively blocked the release of notes between the warmongering British PM and George Bush. It is pretty clear already from leaks and witness statements that Blair made an unconditional promise to Bush a year earlier that he would join in the invasion of Iraq. And if he did, then he lied to Parliament, because the mantra we heard every day as the military build-up continued was, "No decision has been taken." Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, also now accused of aiding and abetting the US torture program, frequently said the same thing. However, Blair's enemies in the mainstream political world are not giving up. David Owen, ex-Labourite and one-time Foreign Secretary, has written that Blair can still be arraigned for contempt of Parliament, while others have more or less openly called on whistleblowers to leak the documents. In addition, there is the war crimes route. Nobody expects the prosecution to go ahead as of now, but things can change. With their decision to open an investigation into allegations of systematic torture and maltreatment by UK military in Iraq, the International Criminal Court has established the precedent that international law applies to NATO governments too. The problem for the UK establishment is that their doctrine of sovereign immunity means that they refuse to put politicians on trial or even investigate war crimes, and this is precisely the condition that has to be met for an ICC probe to be opened. With his political cronies drifting away from the centres of power, time is not on Blair's side. But he does have one thing in his favour. NATO politicians have since behaved in ways that make the invasion of Iraq look almost humanitarian. The blanket bombing and destruction of Libya, the cynical use of Al-Qaeda to promote a ghastly civil war in Syria, and another NATO-instigated civil war now developing in Ukraine, all have the full support of the UK's Liberal Democrats, who have traditionally led the anti-Iraq war lobby. Government advisor David Boyle of the New Economics Foundation think tank has come up with some pretty dire predictions for Britain in the next 20 or 30 years if the current housing boom continues. He sees a huge proletariat, a tiny elite, and a almost non-existent middle class. This pattern has already taken place, or does take place, in many other countries, so it's not impossible. Meanwhile, in France, the economist Thomas Piketty has written what could turn out to be a seminal work, Capital in the 21st Century, and to judge by the controversy and attacks on him, because he is attacking the current system, he's got something going for him. So Roy Hunter, our correspondent, you've been looking at these issues. How do you see the future panning out on present trends?
Yeah, hi Ian. Well, David Boyle made these statements at the Hay Festival. He's, as we said, a fellow at the New Economics Foundation, which is a think tank which it informs the government. They use them as advisors sometimes. David Boyle himself was an independent reviewer. He did a thing called the Boyle Review, investigating the public's demand for choices within government services. And I think his statements have been informed by Thomas Piketty's work. So it's interesting to link the two, I think. And he's basically, David Boyle is predicting that there's going to be, the middle class in Britain's going to go extinct. And this is a kind of neoliberal thing we see all over the world, isn't it? The neoliberals in South America and a lot of Africa, what they do is they support a tiny elite who are extraordinarily rich, and that tiny elite then keeps the rest of the population down, and the rest of the population are dirt poor. So this is what he's predicting, really. He's predicting a tiny elite and a huge sprawling proletariat, which will be us. Direct quote from him. The really scary thing is that if in the next 30 years the house prices rise as much as they have done in the last 30 years, then the average house price in Britain will cost 1.2 million by 2045. And he goes on to say
that's the average. Sorry to interrupt. That's the average price.
That's the average price.
So sort of a typical London house would cost possibly twice as much. An ordinary house. It's 2 million quid for a house in London.
And he's saying, and this is a quote from Asher Bennett writing in the Huffington Post. And this would leave the next generation in hock to landlords. Boyle predicts that this will necessitate households having to hold down 3 or 4 jobs just to pay the rent.
Which we're seeing already in America.
Yeah. And he's also predicting that that means the sprawling proletariat, so 99% of everybody, because they're working so hard and got so little money, they'll have no time or money for any cultural activities. So
or political activities.
Or political activities, indeed. Yeah. But Thomas Piketty's caused quite a stir. Some people have said his book's the most important writings on economics since Milton Friedman back in the 70s.
Right, and Milton Friedman set the stage for the neocons, although some people say he's been misrepresented and he wasn't nearly as bad as, like Adam Smith, he wasn't actually as bad as his enemies say.
No, but it was something for his, a political agenda that was already there, were able to grab him and use his works for their own ends, really. So since 2008, average real earnings, so after inflation's taken account of, have fallen by 8 or 10%. Inflation's been going up since then, and of course the inflation figures don't include house prices these days, do they?
Right, is that right?
Yeah. So the inflation figures you get, if you were to take house prices into there, would be much higher
horrific.
than they are. Yeah.
And certainly here in London, the house prices and rentals. At first it looked like it was just because of the Olympics, but it wasn't. No. It seems to be driven by something else.
Yeah, and the graph you're seeing now shows how average real earnings have changed since 1979. And Britain is increasingly an unequal society. But back in the 70s, it was the second most equal society in Western Europe, behind Sweden.
So we've moved from second most equal to bottom of the league?
Bottom of the league.
Literally bottom of the league.
Literally bottom of the league.
Below Hungary.
Yeah. So, and I do view that America is the most unequal society, and then we follow them up quite quickly. The spiel they give is that, well, that unequal society is driving capitalism, so that drives the economy and makes everybody work hard. But that's, Thomas Piketty shows that not to be true either. Growth in the 1970s averaged 2.4 a year, and since 2000 it's been 1.6. So that doesn't work either, really.
No. And it's the old saying, isn't it? To get the rich to work harder, you pay them more, and to get the poor to work harder, you pay them less.
Yeah. But he's also saying that people's earnings have become decoupled from productivity. So productivity with technology and everything is going up, but people's wages aren't at all. I'm going to quote now Will Hutton writing in The Guardian. If capital is reinvested, it yields between 4 and 5% a year, which outstrips economic growth. Wealth inequalities therefore increase. This has been true of almost all of human history. The 20th century was exceptional because of the capital shocks of the 2 world wars, decolonisation and the growth of the welfare state. There's no mistake that the Duke of Westminster and the Earl of Cardigan are 2 of the richest men in Britain, by virtue of the fields in Mayfair and Chelsea their families owned centuries ago. Yeah. So he's implying that all that that wealth that came from selling Mayfair and Chelsea has been passed down the family and built the capital. Carrying on with him, anyone with the capacity to own in an era when the returns exceed those of wages and output will quickly become disproportionately and progressively richer. The incentive is to be a rentier rather than a risk taker.
A rentier is somebody who sticks their money in an asset, which then, like owning a house.
Yeah, so they're getting return from their assets and not actually doing any work.
Right.
Our rich don't need to back frontier innovation or even invest to produce. They just need to harvest the returns, and the tax breaks, tax shelters and compound interest will do the rest.
That's a bit like Jane Austen's time, when everything that you heard about somebody was what income they had. They were all rentiers in those days, weren't they, the English middle classes? Yeah. And we're going back to that. Yeah. But here's a point. What about the possibly better run countries like China or even Russia, which were always seen as basket cases? If they're doing a more sensible sort of economics, just ordinary social democrat economics from the
well, this is the whole premise of Thomas Piketty's book.
They're going to way overtake us.
Yeah, but this is what Thomas Piketty is saying, that our capital holders, the rich in this country, don't need to invest their money in innovative technology. Yeah. Because they can just sit on the capital and take the wealth, and therefore the country is going to fall behind because we're not producing that technology. We're not fighting. We haven't got forward-thinking business, really. This is the whole premises of his book. That rentier class, that rentier mindset, where you don't have to invest, you can just sit on your assets. That's what's harming our economy.
Right.
And this is his argument, that we need to tax property. We need to tax inherited wealth.
Yeah.
To force them to then start investing in innovative technology.
The risk of misquoting another of our correspondents, I seem to recall that Clive Menzies from Critical Thinking was arguing something similar, how it's capital that you need. Everybody talks about income, but it's capital that you actually want to tax, not income in a way, because capital really is just inequality, pure inequality, and most capital is inherited, or at least partially inherited.
This process started to reverse. So the equality we saw post-war started to reverse in the 70s and 80s as growth rates slowed, capital was rebuilt, and taxes on wealth and income were all cut. This has been the program, hasn't it, for the last 2 or 3 decades, is that you cut the taxes on the rich, and theoretically they then invest that in business. Trickle
down.
Yeah.
Investment. Yeah.
So, but it does seem, and this is what Thomas Piketty is showing, that they're not reinvesting that money. They're sitting on it and living off the interest. Yeah. So a quote from Piketty. He says, "If democracy is someday to regain control of capitalism, it must start by recognising that the concrete institutions in which democracy and capitalism are embodied need to be reinvented again and again."
Yes.
So I'd like to link this now to a study that's been published in the Journal of Science called Poverty Impedes Cognitive Function. And what it's saying is basically that the poor spend so much time and energy, mental energy, paying bills, seeking out bargains, just juggling day-to-day life, that they they haven't got the mental energy to do anything else, to be involved in politics or anything like that. So, and they say it's an equivalent of a loss of 13 IQ points, which is quite enormous, really. And that's equivalent, they say, to losing a night's sleep or being a chronic alcoholic. And it says people use less preventative health care, do not stick to drug regimens, are tardier and less likely to keep appointments, are less productive workers, less attentive parents, and worse manager of their finances. So this graph shows that, contrary to popular belief, the Germans are only working 1,396 hours a year, with the Greeks are working 2,033 hours a year.
So the average Greek in a job is working half as much again, practically, as the average German, who are claiming that it's due to Greek laziness that the Greeks are in such a bad state economically.
Yeah. But the one good thing here is the Swedes, the city of Gothenburg, which is the second largest Swedish city, this year they're trialling 6-hour workdays. So people are still going to be paid for 8 hours a day, but they're trialling 6-hour workdays, which they're hoping the added efficiency of more productive people will offset those extra 2 hours. So.
Well, so there's hope there anyway. Well, thanks very much, Roy.
Thank you.
In the last episode, we were talking to Dan Nesbitt from Big Brother Watch, a UK-based campaign to limit the surveillance state. In the second part of the interview today, we're going to be looking at the internet. So Dan, there seem to be 2 issues really on the internet. There's there's them spying on us and collecting the data when they shouldn't be, in America in total breach of their own constitution. But then there's also the issue of them blocking us from information which we have a right to. So, can you give me a few insights into that?
Well, with internet censorship, and a lot of the thinking around at the moment is blocking extremist websites, linking to terrorists' information and things like that. We really want there to be 2 safeguards put in place, and that's, again, transparent system. So we know who's doing the blocking, how they're appointed, and what the process is for it. So we don't really want just like a faceless civil servant who's unaccountable to be just arbitrarily blocking websites. No. And secondly, we want the whole process to be judiciary led. So there's a judge properly overseeing which websites are blocked and for which reasons, because they're the ones who have the knowledge of the law and saying, actually, this isn't a website that you want to be blocking, but this one might be. Yeah,
but without a judge, without independent oversight, some people would argue the British judiciary isn't that independent, but they're a lot better than anonymous civil servants and government ministers. So, how do you see? Is there legislation proposed to go ahead with website blocking?
I'm not sure. I think it's one of those things that comes round every now and again. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not sure though. So.
Right. If a website's promoting violence, surely that's illegal anyway. to promote violence. Why do they need to censor it? I mean, have I missed something there?
Well, I think it's one of the things they need to deal with on a case-by-case basis, almost looking exactly what's on the website and then making the decision from that. A lot of them, as you say, is illegal anyway, and therefore doesn't need more legislation.
And now, of course, the huge issue of the day, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and the data collection.
Yeah.
I mean, what's Big Brother Watch? What are your general feelings about this problem?
Well, he definitely highlighted a severe problem, and we're doing what we can to sort of raise awareness of the issue, because particularly in Britain, the response hasn't been that brilliant from the legislators and lawmakers, because where you see in America, we've got Obama initiating 2 presidential reviews, we've got congressional inquiries, we've got politicians from each party coming out and saying their views on it, whereas here it's taken until this year to get politicians such as Nick Clegg and Yvette Cooper to actually come out and start talking about it properly. The ISC has an inquiry, but it's progressing quite slowly. So we're really trying to push forward the debate. We're doing that in various ways, such as raising awareness through the media, but also we're taking GCHQ to the European Court of Human Rights at the moment. Yeah, over their mass collection of communications program Tempora. So that's at the moment progressing through the courts. So.
I read that they got all sorts of nasty little devices for putting in people's computers that will turn their webcams into spy cameras and things. I don't know the details, but is that right? Do you think?
I think the one you're referring to there is an operation called Optic Nerve, which they have abandoned, not abandoned, but they've discontinued.
They say they've discontinued.
Well, we've got their word for it, so if we can have, that's the only information we have on it. So they've said they discontinued it, but that was.
If they discontinued it and then started again with a new name, they would say that they hadn't been lying.
Yeah, well, we don't know that, so we don't. But all they said is they've been discontinued it, so that's the information we've got. But that was to basically, I think, hack into people's webcams, and I think it was about every 5 minutes it's an they take an image from the webcam and store it. It's ostensibly to get facial recognition of terrorists.
But on the question of mass data collection, how realistic do you think it is? I mean, obviously we all live in hope, but given that it seems that GCHQ are absolutely at the heart of this global system, that what is it called? The Anglo, it's the British, the Australians.
Five Eyes, is that the one we're talking about?
Yeah, the Five Eyes. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to break that cartel, isn't it? Because they work by, they tell the Americans they're not collecting American data, but then they get the British to collect the American data and the Americans to collect the British data, and then they swap it over. And I mean, if they're going to those sort of levels, how can we have any hope?
Well, we just sort of have to keep pushing the debate forward, really. I mean, it's been brought out by Edward Snowden. We have to really try and keep it in the public eye now and keep it in the public awareness that this has happened, and then we have to push legislators to make the proper reforms so it doesn't happen again.
Change the culture of the organisations, I guess.
Try, yeah.
Now, I read recently that there's been a poll in America which shows that the opinion has swung in favour of Snowden. Initially, the American public were quite critical of Snowden, but it seems that now more and more people do regard him as a hero. And I mean, do you have any knowledge about the public opinion on this?
Oh, I think in general, I think it is starting to swing more behind him. I think it's almost as people look into it and find out exactly how it affects them, because beforehand, when you've got people talking about data collection and mass surveillance, they're quite arbitrary things in many ways because people don't come across them in their everyday life. But once they start finding things out about, I think in this country, the tipping point was the webcams you spoke about earlier, when they found out about MI5 and GCHQ hacking into webcams. That was something that they could tangibly affect them.
Hacking into people's webcams.
Yeah, so I mean, once they find an issue that affects them, then they start looking into it more and thinking, actually, this does affect me, not just it's not just an arbitrary thing. Data collection hasn't actually stopped any terrorist attacks. So once facts like that start coming out, then people are thinking, actually, is it to do with security or is it just being overzealous?
I mean, I guess you probably are active on that issue as well, that even the best, most necessary information has to be kept secure.
Absolutely. I mean, we see it from all levels of government, local government, central government, and organisations such as the NHS. Once you start giving them information, more and more information, there's the likelihood that some of it will either be leaked by accident, or like someone will just take materials. Then that just becomes more and more of a danger. So obviously we think it should be kept secure, but it's just making people aware that when they give their information out, it does go somewhere, I think.
Yeah, quite. It does go somewhere, and it is stored and never goes away, in a sense. So is there much that the ordinary person can do about this?
Well, I think being careful about what information they give out is the main thing they can do. If you don't give out your information on a hugely regular basis, then people can't collect it. Obviously, it's becoming more and more necessary, but if you keep it to the bare minimum, I think that's a very good starting point.
Trying to contact your MP?
That's a good one, because obviously MPs have to listen to their constituents, so the more constituents that contact them about it, the more they'll realise this is more of an issue. So. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad with that note of optimism. I'll say thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you.
And there's still hope. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Take Two, brought to you by RADTV and disseminated by The People's Voice. Thank you for watching. See you next time.